Welcome back to High Impact Growth. Today we have part 2 of Dimagi's founding story. If you didn't hear part 1, I recommend you check that out first. In today's episode, you'll hear about some of the key turning point moments in Dimagi's story: the shift to open source technology, the launch of our SaaS platform, and key hires. You're also going to hear from one of those key early hires, Dimagi's current Chief Strategy Officer, Neal Lesh. You'll also get a look at how Dimagi's culture has evolved over the last 20 years. Let's start with John on the business model evolution.
One of the big transitions, and we've had many around our business model, was we started to see the end of the project lifecycle for our projects come up. And it taught us that nothing related to impact was dictating whether the software was going to keep getting used. It was just whether the project as a whole was going to get renewed. And there was very little chance of sustainability for the software if the entire project didn't get renewed. And that really led us to thinking through, okay, not just how is Dimagi going to survive as a company, but how is each of our individual projects going to survive as a project and be sustainable? Because with software, creating the impact isn't in getting to deployment, it's running a successfully designed system for years, right? So the initial build phase, the initial rollout, that creates zero impact. That's actually just work. It's negative impact. The impact gets generated after you've run for many, many years. And so that led us to really focusing on not just building open source software, but contributing to open source platforms. So at that time, we were working on the engine that's inside Open Data Kit and ComCare and many other popular tools 10 years ago. As an open source consortium, we were working on contributing to OpenMRS. We were working on an SMS-based system with UNICEF called Rapid SMS. And so really trying to contribute to these open source platforms to make sure they were sustainable and leveraging open source platforms.
Okay, so pretty early on, you identified the value of contributing to open source software and really committed to delivering open source software. What came next?
Another big pivot came when that helped us successfully build community around the software, but at the project level, we were still having the same sustainability problems. So we then started offering ComCare, which was our main open source platform, as a SaaS product. And that allowed customers to be able to pay a low recurring fee onto our platform to keep using it, and gave them a path to sustainability outside of an entire multi-million or tens of millions of dollars project getting renewed. And I think that was a critical change for the company's business as well in terms of how to offer sustainability. Those are business model pivots. I think the really, just amazing thing about why we've been so successful, though, was so many key hires along the way. I think we've been incredibly fortunate to attract just phenomenal talent of people who are driven by impact, bringing an amazing work ethic, bringing amazing intelligence and amazing skills across all of our geographies. And there's so many key hires that we've had over the years that have driven innovations in how we deliver services or innovations in our technology.
I pushed John to share a bit more about a few of those key hires. And there have been many, and we'll hear from many of them throughout the course of this podcast. Here he talks about 2 people in particular.
Our current CTO, Clayton Sims, has been with the company for over a decade. And he originally came in when he was still an undergrad at MIT and started working with us and working with Corey Zhu, our CTO at the time. And Corey and Clayton were both phenomenal technology leaders for the company. And I think their ethos of really sacrificing what an ideal engineering problem would look like to make more impact on the ground was something I learned from both of them. There's a lot of challenging engineering problems we force ourselves to solve in order to make sure our software can work offline and at the last mile. And they're not necessarily classic fun engineering problems. They're somewhat challenging engineering problems that you're like, why are we solving for this minority of use cases? And for us, it's critical to reach as many users as possible and really make sure that the approach we're taking to deploying technology hopefully decreases inequity in healthcare services and in all services that we're supporting. And those are not fun problems to solve as an engineer. And I didn't quite realize how substantial of a trade-off you have to make to pull this off. Really different ways you can engineer things if you're willing to sacrifice that last 20% of your user base who's too hard to reach. And a lot of billion-dollar or trillion-dollar companies do make that sacrifice, and we don't, and I'm really proud that we don't. But it's certainly not for everyone.
So Clayton really set the stage for a team that's willing to do the hard thing to make sure our product is accessible and usable by everybody. Next, John speaks to another early team member, Neal Lesh.
When he and I started our professional relationship, which blossomed into a great friendship as well, he was not working for Dimagi. He was at a nonprofit called D-Tree, who was one of our critical early partners of ComCare, what we're now well known for. And that collaboration of constantly getting to talk about what's going to be impactful, what's going to work for the CHW, what's going to work to make this program better, was very unique because they were relatively smaller than our other customers at the time, who were much bigger NGOs. And they just cared about how to make the program the best. They didn't care about getting reports back to donors. They didn't care about data collection for data collection's sake. And that, I think, allowed us to be very aligned on how we were doing our engineering work on ComCare from the early days. And so that was critical not just for Dimagi, but also for ComCare to be as successful as it is, driving impact for frontline workers.
How did you first connect with Neal?
The first time I got to spend a lot of time with Neal, we flew together to South Africa working together on a project that was building a decision support application for HIV care and treatment. And we had this amazing experience together where we had funding, we had, South Africa had a huge HIV burden at the time, and it was us and one other individual. And we were trying to ask this hospital whether they wanted to use this technology and whether we could do a study with them. And they were like, no, we're all set. We are happy with what we're doing on paper. And Neal and I were like, cool, let's go. And let's go try to find the next site that maybe does want us. And the third person we were with was really trying to advocate for them to adopt the system. And we were like, this is great that they don't want to do the project with us. Like, if we do this trip and we find 10 sites that all don't want to do the project, that's a great sign. Maybe we should not do the project. And it was a really interesting meeting of the minds where Neal and I were very aligned on it's a good thing that this project doesn't want to work with us. And so that was kind of the first experience we had. And then we just, stayed up late talking on all these different topics and thinking through all these different models. And that was the start of it. And then we, emailed nonstop for years after that, just trying to push forward ComCare and other projects together. And then eventually he did come over to Dimagi, which was a great experience. He's been with us for a really long time.
So clearly Neal Lesh was a key player in the formation of Dimagi. I wanted to hear from him as part of this episode as well. All right, Neal, thank you so much for joining us. How did you and John start working together?
It was a very small space of people back in 2004, 2005. There weren't very many people doing this kind of thing. So we quickly got connected to each other through multiple ways. But I was getting my master's degree working with one of the professors there, Mark Mitchell, who eventually launched D-Tree with me, helping him. And then Dimagi was subcontracted for some of the early work by D-Tree, and John came in as part of the discussions with Mark.
I wanted to get to know a bit more about Neal, as those first key hires are so critical to building a company's culture. So Neal, what would you say is the thing that drives you?
I'd say my goal is to die happy, having led a purposeful life. I get a lot of satisfaction over applying creativity and maybe certain perspectives on how humans work to address compelling challenges in the world.
What was your first impression of Dimagi and what Dimagi was up to?
One thing that stood out was it was a for-profit rather than a nonprofit. And almost all the other groups I worked with were nonprofits. And I think my general inclination and kind of attitude was more of a nonprofit kind of attitude. So that was distinctive. And then it was also like the dynamics of the group were different in that it was mostly like young software developers that were driving this versus more like public health people with a little bit of technical experience that were in a lot of the other groups that I was connected with. And the culture of Dimagi was really distinct because of those factors. So it was like very ambitious, very dynamic, very much of an attitude of conquering the world. One of the ironic things that developed from this, Dimagi seemed to be much more like altruistic and generous than a lot of the other nonprofits I was with. Like Dimagi would like take on little projects for free, just like exciting stuff. And I think part of this was because like the team demanded it. One of the analogies or reference points we would use back then was this British, I think, cartoon called Pinky and the Brain, which is about a big mouse and a little mouse. And every day the big mouse says to the little mouse, like, what are we going to do today? And the little mouse says, well, same thing we do every day, make a plan to take over the world. and then they like try to take over the world. And like we understood that we were those mice and we were trying to take over the world. And that was a pretty distinctive framing and attitude and ambition relative to the other groups. I think there were, it was double-edged in a lot of ways, but it was certainly exciting and appealing to me to be part of it. And ultimately why I went full in with Dimagi was because I thought they really had the potential, distinguished from a lot of these other groups, to achieve and pursue large-scale change. The other thing that I liked about Dimagi is that it wasn't very sentimental or self-congratulatory. I think it kind of came with being a for-profit group, that we were just results-oriented. Our goal was to be judged by our results and to like think about how do we really make a difference. And other groups, I think it was just easy to feel, oh, we're doing good because we're a nonprofit and we have a good idea and we have good vision, but there wasn't that same kind of like drive to actually deliver useful things.
One of the exciting things about Dimagi is that it seems like it was really an early player in mobile health or mHealth and what we now call digital health. I asked Neal to unpack that with me.
Yeah, I'm sure people see it differently from my perspective. So I kind of joined the fray in 2005. And coincidentally, at least for me, that seems like the beginning of the current era of digital development. A lot of the groups that are prominent now started in the sort of 2005 to 2010 time period. But it's also important to note we were not the first pioneers. There was a previous people who did really foundational work. I think a lot of them aren't persistent. Probably a few of them are, but like there were groups that really did earlier work than us. Some of them helped us along and deserve the kind of pioneer credit. But then 2005 came. One of the big factors was PEPFAR, was kind of a technical thing, which is the U.S. government put a huge amount of money into AIDS treatment for sub-Saharan Africa.
As a side note here, you'll remember that PEPFAR was actually the funder for our first project in Zambia. Back to Neal.
And that really changed the landscape of how health systems were functioning. And it really increased the need for reporting. There was like strong reporting requirements that came with all this money. And so data people were just really in big demand. And so that provided a lot of opportunity for all the software developers with idealism and wanting to build open source systems. And that gave a good boost to things. And then I'm sure other factors came in. And in the beginning, it was much more electronic medical record systems and reporting systems that were prominent. So it wasn't until, in my memory, around 2008, 2009, that mobile health or mHealth really started to rise, and we were the little player on the block for a while. The big players were eHealth, electronic health systems, and then there was the rise of mHealth. mHealth became very big. Then everybody realized mHealth didn't really make sense. That we didn't talk about laptop health, and there were all sorts of very, very different things being done on mobile phones, and so that shifted. At least people sometimes still use the term mHealth, but I certainly use digital health now, and it covers much more of like, oh, how do we use digital? But the specific thing about the excitement around phones started, I think, a few years into our work, and then we kind of rode that wave that as it developed.
So that's a bit of history about Dimagi's founding. Before we close, I did want to ask one more question of this group, which is really around culture. You may have noticed each of these voices you heard from, they have a lot in common. These are men in their 20s with access to elite institutions based in the Boston area, a fairly homogenous group. And today, if you look at Dimagi and Dimagi's culture, we're an incredibly diverse organization with people all over the world. And I wanted to know, how did that culture evolve and what has that journey been like? First, let's hear from Vikram.
It was a very different company. I think those days, it was sort of as though you were sitting in John's dorm room for the first several years. And then we grew up. We had to grow up. We were lucky we grew up when we grew up. And I think the culture changed in a way where we started to respect that there are just different ways to do things. We were able to accomplish what we did because there was internal cohesiveness between within this group of close friends. And we were able to move beyond that to now it's not because everyone's a friend of the founder CEO, but everyone's believing in the same ideals and everyone is respected for how different and how much they may not want to be a friend of the founder CEO, but they believe in what he believes in.
Now let's hear Neal's take on that cultural evolution.
It's certainly changed a lot. We've shifted to, much less hustle, much less scrappiness, much more focus on team. We didn't have a HR department or a POPs group, a people operations group. And I don't know if we even aspired to having one when we first started, but certainly we've come to realize that's central to our mission is to have a strong people operations, strong team focus, much more of the marathon rather than the sprint kind of mentality. We've kept key elements of our core early culture, including being candid and open to evolution and change. All through that, I think that's been a constant where we've always known we have a lot wrong. Maybe we think we're less wrong than others, but we've been interested in learning and changing and correcting and, eager and at least open to hearing alternative perspectives, and then making decisions and moving on. But I think that sense of kind of candidness has really stayed true. I think the ambition and the drive, I think we're less trying to conquer the world. I think it's not as much, at least, a prevalent kind of attitude that works at this scale and maturity. It's kind of an immature attitude, and we've had to mature into having a more nuanced view of how to have a big vision and have big dreams and goals and to be looking towards big scale, but in a slightly more moderated way. We have different kinds of people joining Dimagi, different life situations, different backgrounds, I think different attitudes. And I've been really pleased to see how we can grow and accommodate different styles. John, Vikram, and I all operate in certain ways that's had some kind of success. And then we know that there's lots of other modes of success. And I think we've been able to kind of diversify that and are trying to make space for a much wider set of approaches and styles.
And let's hear a last word from John.
I think one of the things I'm really proud of is that our core statement that we care about impact, team, profit in that order really hasn't changed as we've continued to grow. And trying to always ask ourselves, how's this going to impact our team? How's this going to make more impact? And then the last thing we talk about is how's this going to be more profitable? In fact, you probably never have heard me ask you, how's this going to be more profitable since you joined the company? And I think that's something that is great, because we know by creating an impact, team, profit flywheel, if we solve for impact and team, we'll eventually find a way to the profit.
I learned a lot working on this episode, and there's a lot to unpack here. I'll share my top 6 takeaways. So first of all, luck plays a role here. As it does in many successful companies' stories, we were lucky to have such a massive and impactful first project. It was lucky that the founders crossed paths as they did. Second, Vikram and John are both very entrepreneurial. They wanted to start companies, they had that bug, and they also had the stamina to weather challenges. Third, I love seeing how our focus as a company really has not wavered over the last 20 years. We were focused on impact, on the frontline worker from the very first project. This is the foundation for our core value of prioritizing impact, team, and profit in that order. Fourth, because of our focus on impact, we've been willing to make hard decisions to keep us on that path, even when it meant walking away from a project worth half of our revenue at the time. Fifth, we've always cared about inclusive design and technology. We decided to solve the hard problem so that our tech could be usable in incredibly difficult offline settings, even though these may not have been sexy engineering problems to solve. Sixth, I think we're still growing up as a company as we work to build an inclusive and truly global culture. And it's an exciting ride. So we'll talk about many of these themes in episodes to come. But that's it for today. Thank you so much for joining and for listening.